I sat across from Daniela Weiss, and the first thing I noticed wasn't her words, it was her certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't flinch, doesn't blink, and absolutely refuses to apologize. She didn't come to justify Israeli settlements in the West Bank. She came to defend them with fire. And from the moment she opened her mouth, the tone was set. This wasn't going to be a soft conversation. It was going to be a collision. She didn't hesitate. This land belongs to the Jewish people, she said, as if stating the weather. No pause, no ambiguity. For her, the debate is over. History, scripture, and security all back her claim. But as she spoke, I couldn't help but think of the images I've seen, the bulldozers, the military patrols, the Palestinian homes flattened in the name of expansion. Is this defense or domination? Weiss smiled through the criticism. Her confidence is disarming. She talks about settlements as though they are a moral mission. Not just legal, not just strategic, but sacred. God gave us this land, she said. We're not stealing it. We're fulfilling our duty. There was no concern about UN resolutions or international condemnation. In her view, the world simply doesn't understand the truth of Jewish destiny. I pushed her. I brought up the checkpoints, the demolished villages, the human cost of what some call apartheid. But Weiss didn't flinch. She said the word occupation is a myth, a weapon used against Israel to twist the narrative. According to her, Israel isn't occupying anything, it's reclaiming. There never was a Palestinian state, she told me. This isn't theirs. It never was. That sentence hung in the air like smoke, dense, choking, impossible to ignore. She speaks in absolutes. Good versus evil, right versus wrong. For her, Jewish settlements in the West Bank aren't an obstacle to peace. They're the path to justice. And she doesn't care if the world sees her as a hardliner. Peace, she asked, raising an eyebrow. There can be no peace if we give away our birthright. To her, compromise isn't noble, it's betrayal. But here's what unsettled me most. It wasn't just her ideology, it was how normal it sounded in her voice. She spoke of expanding settlements like she was talking about building schools. She framed every action, every encroachment into Palestinian territory as progress. And when I questioned whether the rights of Palestinians were being trampled in the process, she pushed back with full force. They can live here, she said, but under Jewish sovereignty. That wasn't tolerance. That was dominance disguised as coexistence. I brought up the violence because it's real. Settler attacks, burned olive trees, children caught in the middle. Weiss shook her head, dismissing it as Palestinian propaganda. She claimed the settlers were the ones under attack, that the media had twisted the story, and maybe that's what struck me most. Her total confidence in her own narrative, even when it directly contradicted what the world has seen on the ground. There's no denying her influence. Daniela Weiss isn't just a fringe voice. She's been at the heart of the settlement movement for decades. She's led marches, organized communities, and mentored the next generation of ideologues. To some Israelis, she's a hero. To Palestinians, she's the face of the occupation. And to the rest of us, watching from outside, she's a lightning rod for a conflict that refuses to end. The tension in the room grew with every exchange. I tried to challenge her with facts. She came back with faith. I quoted international law. She quoted the Torah. And that, perhaps, is the essence of this issue. It's not just about politics, it's identity, history, divinity. To Weiss, the settlements aren't an option. They're a promise. And any effort to stop them is seen as an attack on Jewish existence itself. By the end of the interview, one thing was clear. Daniela Weiss isn't trying to win anyone over. She's not here to soften her message. She's here to declare it loudly, unapologetically. And no amount of global pressure, no viral outrage, no angry protests will change her mind. And maybe that's what makes this conflict so intractable. When belief becomes absolute, when the past is used to justify the present, and when the suffering of others is either denied or dismissed, it leaves no room for middle ground. And that's exactly what was missing in our conversation. I left that interview with more questions than answers, but I also left with a deeper understanding of just how deep this conflict runs, not just in politics, but in the hearts of people like Daniela Weiss. People who don't see themselves as aggressors, but as guardians. Not as settlers, but as saviors. And until that worldview is reckoned with, not just by critics, but by Israelis themselves, peace will remain a distant dream. She didn't come to justify. She came to declare. And the world, whether it agrees or not, is now forced to listen. I asked her directly, do you believe Palestine has a right to exist as a state? She looked at me calmly and said, there is no such thing as Palestine, so That sentence didn't come with hesitation, no softening, no diplomatic language. Just a flat-out denial of something millions of people around the world recognize, fight for, and call home. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just having a political discussion. I was stepping into a different reality entirely. Daniela Weiss doesn't see Palestine the way much of the world does. To her, it's not a nation waiting for recognition. It's a narrative, one she believes was invented to erase Jewish history and undermine Israel's legitimacy. She doesn't believe there ever was a Palestinian people or a sovereign Palestinian state. In her eyes, the entire identity is a political fiction. I pressed her. I mentioned the people, the culture, the language, the flag. I brought up the decades of struggle, the refugee camps, the history of British Mandate Palestine. But none of it moved her. Arab people lived here, she admitted, but that doesn't make it their country. For her, there's a difference between people existing in a land and that land being theirs. And that difference is where this entire conflict becomes so volatile. She views the land, Judea and Samaria, as she insists on calling it, not as disputed territory, but as a sacred inheritance, one that was promised not just by history or war, but by God himself. When I pointed out that Palestinians have lived in this land for generations, she didn't deny their presence, but she denied their ownership. They were tenants, she said. We are the landlords. That phrasing hit hard, not just because of how cold it sounded, but because it revealed the entire framework through which she views this conflict: hierarchy, entitlement, and permanence. What struck me most was how effortless her denial sounded. Not aggressive, not angry, just certain. For her, the international community can pass resolutions, the media can run documentaries, and the streets can flood with protesters. It won't change the truth she holds on to. In her worldview, Palestine doesn't exist because it never should have existed. This isn't just a political stance, it's an ideological wall. And behind that wall is a deeply rooted belief that recognizing a Palestinian state would mean denying Jewish destiny. She sees it as a zero-sum game. If Palestine wins, Israel loses. And so she refuses to acknowledge even the possibility of Palestinian sovereignty. I brought up the Oslo Accords, the peace efforts, the international consensus around a two-state solution. She waved it all away. You can't make peace with a lie, she said, and Palestine is a lie. That sentence stayed with me. Because if that's where the conversation starts, where can it possibly go? What about the people who live there now? The families in Ramallah, Hebron, Nablus, the generations who've grown up under occupation, checkpoints, and restricted movement. They can live here, she replied, but under Israeli control. In other words, no flag, no independence, no recognition, just survival under another nation's authority. It's hard to explain what it feels like to hear that so plainly. No euphemisms, no attempts to soften the blow. Just a blunt rejection of an entire people's national identity. And yet, it's a viewpoint held by more than a few. Daniela Weiss may be controversial, but she's not alone. Many within the Israeli settler movement share her belief that acknowledging a Palestinian state would be suicidal for Israel's future. There's a kind of comfort in absolutes. It simplifies a messy world. And for people like Weiss, the story is simple. The Jews were exiled, the Jews returned, the land was promised, and the promise will be fulfilled. Everything else, history, politics, international law, is just noise. But that noise includes real people. People who have suffered. People who dream of a home, a passport, a future free from military occupation. And when that entire identity is denied, when it's not just rejected, but erased, what does that say about any path forward? As the interview went on, I realized we weren't even speaking the same language anymore. I was asking about statehood, borders, negotiations. She was speaking about destiny, prophecy, and non-negotiable rights. It wasn't a debate. It was a clash of two entirely different realities. And yet, she didn't raise her voice once. That's what made it chilling. She didn't need to. Her words had the weight of unshakable belief. And that belief didn't leave room for compromise. Not because she hates Palestinians, but because, in her view, their identity as a nation simply doesn't exist. I ended the interview with a heavy feeling. Not because I was surprised, but because I saw up close the depth of the divide. This isn't just about land, it's about existence. About who gets to belong and who gets to be erased. And when one side refuses to even acknowledge the other's legitimacy, peace becomes more than difficult, it becomes almost unimaginable. She didn't just deny a state, she denied a people. And in doing so, she reminded me of the true heart of this conflict. Not just walls and borders, but the stories we tell about who we are and who we refuse to let the other side become. The moment Daniela Weiss walked into the studio, there was a certain stillness, like the air itself paused to see what she'd say. Not because she was loud or angry. Quite the opposite. She was calm, composed, almost warm. But beneath that poise was something far more dangerous: conviction. The kind that doesn't shake, doesn't question, and absolutely doesn't care what the world thinks. She's been called many things over the years. Visionary. Pioneer defender of Israel. But to others, especially Palestinians, international observers, and human rights activists, Daniela Weiss is something else entirely. An extremist, a radical settler leader, a woman whose ideas, if followed to their logical end, spell disaster. Some have even gone further, calling her a terrorist in a suit. And that's exactly what I wanted to understand. Not the polite version of her ideology, not the sound bites, but the raw belief system that's made her such a lightning rod. So I asked her directly, do you understand why people call you extreme? She smiled, not defensively, but almost proudly. Because I say the truth out loud, she replied, and that scares them. So she didn't hesitate to justify actions most of the world condemns. Expanding settlements deep inside the West Bank, absolutely. Building on land designated for Palestinians, not a problem. Supporting youth groups that take over hilltops illegally. That's leadership, she said. She called it Zionism. Others call it provocation. To her, the law of the land doesn't come from the United Nations. It comes from God, and the Torah is her legal framework. I reminded her that some of these settlements have been linked to violence, arsons, property destruction, even attacks on Palestinian families. Again, no flinching. She didn't deny that violence exists. But she flipped the narrative. The settlers are the ones defending themselves, she insisted. The Arabs are the ones attacking. That black and white framing is a hallmark of extremist thinking. One side is always innocent, the other always guilty. But the most chilling part wasn't her denial of wrongdoing. It was her ability to make it all sound completely reasonable. She never raised her voice. She never used slurs, but what she said was far more impactful than any shouting match. Because if you weren't paying close attention, you might almost miss what she was actually justifying. Take the term price tag attacks, the acts of revenge settlers carry out when Israeli authorities dismantle outposts or when Palestinians resist settlement expansion. These attacks include torching mosques, slashing tires, and harassing civilians. I brought this up. She didn't exactly condone it, but she didn't condemn it either. I understand the frustration, she said. These are young people who love the land and feel betrayed. It was the classic dodgy, not an endorsement, but definitely an excuse. That's where the accusations of extremism come from. It's not just what she says, it's what she refuses to reject. When someone dodges violence with euphemisms, when they dress up land theft as heritage, and when they reject the very existence of another people, it crosses a line. It's not just political anymore, it becomes moral. And people are right to be alarmed. I asked her if she believed Palestinians had any legitimate claim to the land. Her answer was immediate. No, they can live here, but they can't own it. This is Jewish land. That wasn't just a territorial claim. That was an erasure of another people's history, culture, and identity. And to millions watching, that's not patriotism. That's extremism. She doesn't see it that way. Of course, in her world, the word extreme is a badge of honor. It means you're not compromising, you're not selling out. She believes that anyone who tries to divide the land or speak of coexistence is either lie or a traitor. And when you live in that binary, anything short of total control is a threat. But here's the part that kept echoing in my mind long after the camera stopped rolling. She's not a fringe figure. Daniela Weiss has influence. She's mentored young activists, inspired settlement movements, and advised politicians. Her ideology isn't just surviving, it's spreading. And when that ideology ignores international law, dismisses the suffering of others, and places one group's destiny above all else, what do you call it if not extremism? I thought about the families on the other side, the Palestinians who've had their homes demolished to make room for settler roads, the farmers who've watched their olive trees uprooted, the children who've grown up behind walls and checkpoints. To them, Daniela Weiss isn't just a voice on television. She's part of the machinery that defines their daily reality. And when they see her celebrated, legitimized, even interviewed, they don't hear dialogue, they hear dismissal. She left the studio the same way she entered it, composed, smiling, certain. But the discomfort she left behind lingered. Because when extremism wears a polite face, when it wraps itself in the language of tradition and nationhood, it becomes harder to confront and far more dangerous. We're used to extremists shouting. Weiss doesn't. She speaks softly, but her message is loud. And if we're not careful, it's that quiet confidence that may shape the next chapter of this conflict. Not through bombs or bullets, but through ideology, one settlement at a time. I sat across from Daniela Weiss knowing this conversation would be a minefield. She didn't come here to hedge, and I certainly didn't come to stay quiet. From the moment the cameras rolled, the tension was thick. Not because we were shouting at each other, but because I knew she'd built her entire worldview on something I couldn't ignoring, the denial of another people's existence, the justification of occupation, and a sense of divine entitlement that left no room for dialogue. And so I challenged her again and again. It started with a question most guests dodge. Do you believe Palestinians deserve a state? Her answer was fast. There is no such thing as a Palestinian state. No hesitation, just absolute certainty. That's when I leaned in. Because when someone erases millions of people with a sentence, you don't let that slide. I reminded her of history, of international law, of the daily lives of real families living behind walls and barbed wire. But she didn't flinch. They can live here, she said. But it's Jewish land, always has been. She wasn't offering peace. She was offering control. I asked her what justice looks like under that view. How does a Palestinian child grow up with dignity if they're told from birth that their homeland isn't theirs, that their identity is fake? She looked at me with that calm smile and said, they're part of a larger Arab world. This is the Jewish homeland. It was a masterclass in erasure, delivered softly but with the weight of unshakable belief. And that's the problem. She doesn't see herself as extreme. She sees herself as honest. I brought up the violence, the price tag attacks, the burning of olive trees, the graffiti scrawled on mosque walls by settlers. She didn't deny any of it existed, but she dismissed it as exaggerated or misunderstood. Our youth are passionate, she said. Passionate, that's what you call it when someone sets fire to a home. When children are forced to flee their villages at midnight because a group of settle storms in with rifles and soldiers standing by. I pressed harder. But what about peace? I asked. Is there any version of this future where both sides live with equal rights? That's when her tone changed. Just slightly. Peace is possible, she said, but only when the Arabs accept Jewish sovereignty. In other words, peace only exists on her terms. I wasn't talking to someone interested in negotiation. I was talking to someone who believed compromise was betrayal. I couldn't help but challenge the theology behind it too. Because when politics is fused with prophecy, you're no longer arguing policies. You're arguing fate. What gives you the right to claim land based on ancient scripture? I asked. There are other people living there now. Doesn't their reality matter? But to her, history wasn't 75 years old. It was 3,000. The land wasn't a negotiation. It was a promise. I brought up international law and resolutions. The fact that the world sees these settlements as illegal. She shrugged. The world is wrong, she said. The Torah is the highest authority. And just like that, decades of global diplomacy were wiped off the table. Because how do you debate facts with someone whose foundation is faith? It's not just about who's right. It's about whose truth matters. As the interview went on, I kept pushing. I couldn't let these claims stand unchallenged. Not because I enjoy confrontation, but because neutrality in the face of extremism isn't journalism. It's cowardice. She spoke of settlers as heroes. I reminded her of the people they displaced. She painted a picture of redemption. I painted one of ruin. She offered a vision of control. I demanded accountability. But here's the thing that stuck with me long after she left. She never got angry. She didn't yell. She didn't storm out. She didn't even seem offended because she's so certain of her position, she doesn't feel threatened by criticism. That's what makes it so dangerous. This wasn't just an ideological clash, it was a moral one, and her quiet confidence made it even more chilling. I ended the interview with one final question. What would you say to a young Palestinian who believes they deserve the same rights, the same land, and the same future as your grandchildren? She paused. Just for a moment. They have many places in the Arab world, she said. This is ours. That was it. No empathy, no reflection, just borders drawn in the blood of history. And that's why I had to challenge her. Because sometimes the most dangerous ideas don't come from people shouting in the streets. They come from people in suits, sitting calmly in studios, speaking as if they've figured out the world. And if you don't push back, those ideas spread like wildfire, wrapped in legitimacy, protected by faith, and left unchecked by silence. So I didn't stay silent. I asked the hard questions. I pressed where it hurt. And I made sure that in a world where one narrative often dominates, someone was there to hold up a mirror, no matter how uncomfortable the reflection.